After years serving a man who treated her like property, the orc believed she would die alone by the side of the road, until a farmer stood before her and spoke words she would never forget. The dust of Redemption Springs didn't move for anyone. It settled on the boots of ranchers, on the hats of merchants, on the backs of horses too tired to shake it off. It settled on everything that stopped moving long enough to be forgotten. Grenda hadn't moved in a long time. She was on the ground in the middle of the main street, one hand pressed into the dirt, the other trembling at her side. Her black braid had come loose. Her emerald skin was marked with bruises the color of old storms. She tried to rise. Her body refused. She tried again. Nothing. Around her, life continued at its usual pace. A woman with a basket of vegetables crossed to the other side of the street without meeting her eyes. Two men near the general store glanced over, leaned together, and exchanged words too low to hear. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed, and the mother pulled him away. Nobody stopped. Grenda pressed her lips together. She had learned, somewhere between the first year and the last, that shame was quieter than pain. Pain made noise inside your chest. Shame sat heavy and still, like a stone you swallowed and never managed to cough back up. She had swallowed so many stones. The stagecoach that had brought her here was already gone. The driver hadn't looked back. He had accepted Victor's word that she was a burden to be dropped at any town along the route, and Redemption Springs had been that town. Her small bag had been thrown first. Then she had been pushed out behind it. That was all. 26 years old, and that was all she had to show. A bag, a body that wouldn't stand. A name that belonged to a woman she barely recognized anymore. She remembered her mother's voice sometimes. Lyra used to sing in the early mornings, before the sun fully appeared, when the world was still half asleep and honest. The songs were old orc songs. Songs about journeys and courage and finding the place where your feet finally decided to rest. Grenda hadn't sung one in years. Victor said those songs sounded like animals calling to each other. He said it with a laugh that made her feel smaller than she already was. She stopped singing after the third time he said it. Now the dirt of a strange town pressed against her palm, and she couldn't stand, and nobody was coming. Except footsteps. Not passing her, not veering away, coming directly toward her. She looked up slowly, because looking up quickly had taught her things she didn't want to remember. A man stood at the edge of her vision. Tall. Wide shoulders under a work-worn jacket. Brown eyes that weren't cold. He crouched down to her level. She flinched. He didn't move closer. He stayed still and let her look at him first. Nobody had done that before. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that had spent years talking to frightened horses and stubborn cattle. Grenda said nothing. Her grey-green eyes watched him the way she had learned to watch everything, looking for the edge, looking for what came after the kind words. He looked at her hands, at her arms, at the bruises along her jaw that she could feel better than she could see. She watched his expression change, not with disgust, not with curiosity, with something that looked like quiet fury, turned inward, held carefully so it wouldn't land on her. "Can you stand?" he asked. She tried again, just to answer honestly. Her arm shook, her knee buckled. He moved then, slowly, with his hands visible, and lifted her from the ground, as if she were something worth handling with care. For a moment, the whole street seemed to go silent. She didn't fight it. She was too tired to fight anything. He said it while he was walking, not looking down at her, but speaking clearly enough that she would hear every word. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." Grenda closed her eyes. She didn't believe him yet, but something small and stubborn inside her chest, something she thought had died somewhere along the road between servitude and this dusty street, shifted slightly. It didn't speak. It just listened, Her name had been chosen by her mother before she was born. Lyra had said it meant rooted one in the old Orc language. The version spoken before the war changed everything. She said it with pride, the way she said most things. Lyra had been proud of her origins, proud of the old songs, proud of the small life she had built with a quiet human man named Edward in a village that mostly left them alone. Grenda had grown up between two worlds without fully belonging to either. The children in the village weren't always cruel, but they were honest the way children were before adults taught them to hide it. She was too green for some, too human in her manners for others. Her ears were pointed but not dramatically. Her small, barely visible fangs appeared only when she smiled wide, and so she learned early to smile with her mouth closed. Edward taught her to read. He sat with her at the table after supper, a candle between them, his patient finger tracing letters she memorized faster than he expected. He taught her to write and to do sums. He said she had a sharp mind, and that a sharp mind was worth more than land, more than cattle, more than anything a person could inherit. She believed him because he never gave her reason not to. Lyra taught her the songs. Every morning, every winter evening, every night when the dark came down heavy and full of sounds, songs about Orc warriors who found peace, songs about mothers who walked 100 miles to bring their children home, songs that didn't need translation because they lived in the body before they lived in the mind. Both parents were gone before Grenda turned 19. First Edward, from a fever that moved too fast, then Lyra, 2 seasons later, from a grief that had no cure. The village was kind at the funerals, and then slowly, quietly, less kind after. Without Edward and Lyra to anchor her there, Grenda found herself becoming invisible. She left one morning with everything she owned in a single bag. She told herself she was looking for a better life. She believed that then. She believed it when Victor Blackwood found her at a crossroads between 2 towns. Sitting on a rock, eating the last of her bread. He was well dressed, his horse was well fed, he had the kind of smile that arrived before the words did. He said he needed help at his supply operation, someone to cook, to organize, to assist with correspondence, given that most of his workers couldn't read. He offered shelter, meals, and fair wages. He said she would be treated well. He said a lot of things. She was 20 years old and alone, and her bread was gone, and the next town was half a day's walk in the wrong boots. She made the only choice that seemed like a choice. She said yes. She didn't know then that some doors close behind you differently than others. Victor's operation was smaller than he described. The correspondence was minimal. What wasn't minimal was the cooking, the cleaning, the washing, the mending, the feeding of his animals, the hauling of water, the endless work that began before sunrise and ended long after dark. The wages never came. When she asked, Victor looked at her with something between amusement and contempt. He said she owed him for the shelter, for the food, for the opportunity he had given someone like her. He said the word like in a way that didn't need explanation. She was too far from anywhere familiar to leave. She told herself it was temporary. That was 6 years ago. The healer's house smelled like dried sage and something older underneath it. The man who had carried her through the street set her down on a low cot near the window. He did it carefully, which she noticed because she had stopped noticing most things, noticing used to get her in trouble. The healer was a woman with grey hair pinned up tight and eyes that had seen enough not to be surprised. She came in from the back room, looked at Grenda once, and immediately went to work without asking unnecessary questions. Her name was Miriam. She had hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades making things better than she found them. She examined Grenda's arms first, then her ribs, pressing carefully along the sides until Grenda drew a sharp breath. Miriam noted something on a small piece of paper and kept moving. The man stood near the door. He hadn't introduced himself, and Grenda hadn't asked. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He wasn't watching her the way men usually watched her, like they were deciding something. He was watching Miriam work, and his jaw was tight, and his hands were closed at his sides. "Bruising along the ribs," Miriam said quietly, mostly to herself. "Older bruising underneath. These cuts on the forearms are recent. Wrists." She paused. "Someone used rope here more than once." The man at the door breathed through his nose. Grenda stared at the ceiling. She had become very good at ceilings. In Victor's various rented rooms and roadside lodgings, she had mapped the cracks and stains of dozens of them. It was something to look at that didn't look back. "She needs weeks of rest," Miriam said. "Good food, no physical labor. These older injuries weren't treated properly." She looked at Grenda directly for the first time since beginning the examination. "Someone hurt you for a long time." It wasn't a question. Grenda didn't answer. "Who did this?" the man asked. His voice was still steady, but there was something underneath it now. A current. She looked at him. Philip Harding. She would learn his name soon. 38 years old. Widowed 5 years. A man that people in this town looked at with genuine respect, not the manufactured kind that Victor had always chased and never earned. "I'd rather not say," she said. Her own voice surprised her. She hadn't used it much in the last few days. "That's all right," Philip said. "You don't have to." She hadn't expected that either. Miriam finished dressing the cuts on her forearms and straightened. "She'll need somewhere to stay, somewhere quiet." Philip said it without hesitation. "She can have the spare room at the farm." Grenda looked at him quickly. "I'm not asking for anything in return," he said, reading her expression with more accuracy than made her comfortable. "You need somewhere safe. I have the room. That's the whole of it." She wanted to ask him what the catch was. She had learned that there was always a catch. People didn't give rooms without wanting something. They didn't carry strangers off the street without a calculation behind it. But Miriam was nodding, like the offer was reasonable, like Philip Harding was the kind of man whose reasonable offers didn't require a second examination. And Grenda's body ached in ways she couldn't count, and she had nowhere else. "All right," she said. Her voice was small, but it was hers. Later, as Philip went to prepare a wagon, Miriam sat beside her and took her hand without asking. "He's a good man," the healer said. "I've known him since his wife died. He hasn't stopped doing right by people since." Grenda looked at the window. Outside, Redemption Springs continued its afternoon, without knowing what had just begun inside that room. She still didn't know if she could trust it. But the sage smell was calming, and the cot was soft. And for the first time in longer than she could name, nobody was telling her what she owed. The farm was larger than she expected. Philip Harding's land stretched past what she could see from the wagon bench. Fenced fields where cattle moved slowly in the late afternoon light. A barn with a fresh-painted door. A main house with a wide porch that faced west, toward the hills. Grenda sat with her bag on her lap and said nothing. The woman waiting at the front steps was wide and practical-looking, with grey hair cut short and an apron over her dress. She came down the steps before the wagon stopped moving. "Mrs. Fenton," Philip said as he climbed down. "This is Grenda. She'll be staying in the east room." Mrs. Fenton looked at her, not with the guarded suspicion Grenda expected, with something more like assessment. The way a person looked at a situation they were already deciding how to improve. "Can you walk?" she asked. "Yes," Grenda said. "Good, because I'm too old to carry anyone, and Philip's got enough to do." She held out her hand for the bag. "I'll show you the room." It was that simple. The east room had a window that looked toward the barn, a bed with clean sheets, a small table with a ceramic pitcher and basin, a braided rug on the floor. It was modest and clean, and it was not in any way a place she was expected to earn. She sat on the edge of the bed, after Mrs. Fenton left, and she didn't move for a long time. The first 3 days, she barely left the room. She told herself she was resting, which was true, but she was also listening. She was cataloguing sounds the way she had learned to do in Victor's company, because sounds gave you warning. Raised voices meant incoming. Footsteps too fast meant danger. Silence sometimes meant worse. What she heard instead was ordinary farm life. Cattle lowing in the early morning. The distant sound of work being done steadily and without drama. Mrs. Fenton moving through the kitchen below. Philip's boots on the porch steps in the evenings, unhurried. Nobody came to her door except to bring food. She ate everything. Her body recognized real meals, the way a person recognized their own name after being called something else for years. On the 4th day, she sat at the window instead of the bed. She watched the ranch hands move between the barn and the field. Watched Philip stop to speak to each of them in turn, leaning on the fence rail with his hat pushed back, listening before responding. The men didn't hurry away from the conversation. They finished it. She noticed that. On the 6th day, she made her own bed with care, old habit. Then she realized no one had told her to and stood there holding the folded sheet for a moment, unsure what to do with the feeling. On the 8th day, she came downstairs. Mrs. Fenton was at the stove. She didn't make a production of Grenda appearing. She simply pointed at the table. "Sit down. Coffee's almost ready." Grenda sat. The kitchen was warm. The coffee was real. Mrs. Fenton set a plate of eggs and bread in front of her and sat across the table with her own cup. "I was a widow at 43, she said, not looking at Grenda, stirring her coffee. "Not by choice. None of them are, really. But I stayed because the work needed doing, and I wasn't the kind to walk away from work." She looked up. "People around here mean well, mostly. Some of them will say the wrong thing. You don't have to explain yourself to anyone." Grenda looked at the plate. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Eat." She ate. Outside, a rooster somewhere decided it was still morning and said so loudly. A horse answered from the barn. Somewhere down the road, a wagon bell rang. Grenda wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and felt its warmth move through her palms. It was the simplest thing in the world. She hadn't felt it in years. The bruises faded the way grief fades, not all at once, but in pieces, leaving behind something changed in the shape underneath. 3 weeks into her stay at the Harding farm, Grenda walked the length of the porch for the first time without holding the railing. Miriam visited twice a week, checking her ribs, her wrists, asking questions, and noting the answers with the same quiet efficiency she had shown that first afternoon. "Your body is recovering well," she told her on the 4th visit. "Your mind will take longer. That's normal." Grenda nodded. She didn't say that some nights she still woke up with her hands pressed flat against the mattress, listening for footsteps that weren't coming. She didn't say that certain tones of voice still made something in her stomach tighten before she could stop it. She didn't say that she sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway for a full minute before entering, running through a silent list of possible wrongs she might have committed. Old reflexes. They were the last things to learn that they weren't needed anymore. What she did instead was observe. She watched the way Philip spoke to the woman who brought laundry from town, politely and without condescension. She watched him resolve a disagreement between 2 ranch hands by listening to both sides in full before speaking a single word. She watched him stop his horse at the fence line one evening to help an elderly neighbor whose wagon wheel had caught in a rut, working in the dust without complaint until it was fixed. He didn't do these things for an audience. That was the part she couldn't quite account for. Victor had performed his generosity. He made sure people saw it. The performance was the point. Philip did things because they needed doing. That was all. One evening, she found herself on the porch after supper without quite deciding to be there. The sun was going down behind the hills. The sky had gone the color of embers. The cattle in the far field were still, and the air smelled like dust and grass and the faint sweetness of something blooming nearby. She sat on the top step, and then, without thinking about it, she began to hum, not loudly, just under her breath, the beginning of one of her mother's songs, the one Lyra had called The Wanderer's Return, the one about a woman who walked so far from home she forgot what home felt like, and then found it again in an unexpected place. Her own voice startled her. She stopped. Then she thought of Victor, saying it sounds like animals calling to each other, and she felt something rare and difficult move through her, not sadness, something closer to anger but quiet, a refusal, small and private. She started humming again. She let the song finish. The stars were beginning to appear. The first ones, faint and early, claiming their place before full dark arrived. She watched them and let the melody fade. Behind her she heard the front door. Philip's footsteps. She recognized them now, even and unhurried. He sat in the wooden chair near the door rather than beside her, giving her the space between them. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You didn't." A comfortable silence. She hadn't known those existed outside of her memories of her parents' house. "That was beautiful," he said, simply, without performance. Her jaw tightened for a half-second with the old reflex, the one that waited for the qualification, for the but, for the way the compliment would be used later. It didn't come. She looked out at the darkening hills. "My mother taught it to me," she said. She hadn't told anyone about her mother in years. Victor had made it clear that her history was irrelevant. She had learned to keep it folded away, small and private, like something you carry in a coat pocket and never take out in company. Philip waited, in case there was more. She decided to let there be more. She was proud of where she came from. She never let me forget the old songs, even when things were hard. She paused. "I forgot them for a while." "You remembered tonight," he said. She almost smiled. "I did," she said. The stars came out slowly, the way real things do. She started teaching the children without planning to. It happened on a Tuesday, which seemed too ordinary a day for anything significant. Mrs. Fenton had mentioned in passing that the Harpers and the Reeds and 3 other families in town were struggling to find someone to sit with the children during the long working hours. The previous arrangement had ended when the woman responsible moved to a larger town with her husband. Philip had brought it up carefully. "You don't have to," he said immediately after mentioning it. "It's not an obligation. I'm not asking you to earn your room." "I know," she said. And she did know, which was the strange part. She spent 2 days thinking about it, turned it over the way she turned things over now, carefully and without panic, which was still new enough to feel unfamiliar. Part of her said she wasn't ready. Part of her said she would never feel ready, and that waiting for that feeling was a way of waiting forever. She told Philip she'd meet with the families. The gathering happened in the small meeting room behind the general store. 7 adults, 2 of them visibly uncertain. Thomas Reed was among the uncertain ones, a broad man with a calloused face who kept glancing at her ears. Elaine Harper sat straight and open-faced and smiled when Grenda entered. Grenda answered their questions honestly. Her background, her parents, what her father had taught her. She didn't hide the orc side, and she didn't exaggerate the human side. She was what she was. Thomas Reed asked, not unkindly but directly, whether she understood the responsibility involved. She looked at him. "I was raised by 2 people who gave me everything they had," she said. "My father taught me to read and write and think. My mother taught me that a person's history has value. I would teach the same things, if you'll allow me." Reed nodded slowly. It wasn't a warm nod, but it was honest. They gave her the chance. The children were easier than the adults, 6 of them at first, ranging from 5 to 9 years old. She arranged them in a loose circle in the mornings, on the floor of the room she'd been given at the back of the community hall. She started with letters and stories. The stories came from both her parents' worlds, sometimes human folk tales Edward had read to her, sometimes the orc legends Lyra had carried like living things in her chest. The children didn't care which was which. They just wanted the next part. A girl named Clara, 7 years old and serious as a judge, came back on the third day with a list of questions she'd written overnight about a legend Grenda had told. Every question was spelled wrong. Every question was exactly right. Grenda sat down with her and answered them all. That evening, Philip was leaning on the porch rail when she returned. He didn't ask how it went. He read something in the way she walked up the steps. "Good day," he said. "Yes," she said. She sat in her usual spot on the step. He stayed at the rail. They watched the evening come in together, the way they'd started doing without either of them naming it as a habit. "Clara Harper wrote me a list of questions," she said after a while. He made a sound of genuine amusement. "That child has been asking questions since she could talk," he said. "Her mother says she once interrogated the minister for 20 minutes after a sermon. Grenda did smile then fully before she caught it. Philip saw it and looked away quietly so she could keep it. She noticed. She held onto the warm weight of the evening and didn't let herself wonder yet how long it would last. Somewhere under the gratitude, something was still waiting. She just didn't know yet that it had a name and a face and was already looking for her. Autumn came to Redemption Springs the way it always did, without ceremony, leaving summer behind like a coat dropped on a floor. The mornings grew cold enough to see your breath. The children arrived at the community hall in heavier coats, their faces flushed from the walk. Grenda had begun keeping a small stove going in the corner of the teaching room, and the children crowded around it before lessons began, as if it were the point of the whole morning. She found she didn't mind. Her relationship with the town was changing slowly, the way water changes stone. Thomas Reed had stopped avoiding her eye when they passed on the street. He had, in fact, stopped one morning to tell her that his youngest daughter had come home the previous week and read an entire page aloud to him at supper. He said it while looking somewhere over her shoulder, but he said it. Grenda said she was glad. That was enough for now. Philip had given her a small advance on what the families paid for the children's care, and she had used part of it to buy a better pair of boots. She had stood in the general store holding them for longer than made sense, because they were the first thing she had chosen and paid for herself in 6 years. The storekeeper waited with patient indifference. She finally set them on the counter. She wore them out of the store. In the evenings, she and Philip had fallen into a rhythm she couldn't name. Not courtship, not exactly, though she was aware of something moving underneath their conversations like water under ice. They talked about the farm, about the children, about the books she had found on the shelf in the sitting room that nobody seemed to be using. One evening she asked about his wife. She asked carefully, giving him room to decline. He didn't decline. He told her about Margaret, how they had married young and worked this land together, how she had died from a fever that came on fast and left faster, taking her in a week, how the house had been very quiet for a long time after, how Mrs. Fenton had arrived 2 months later and simply begun cooking without asking, and he had been too emptied out to object. "She would have liked you," he said after a pause. Grenda looked at the hills. "You don't have to say that," she said. "I know I don't." She believed him. She was getting better at that. Far from Redemption Springs, in a town 2 days' ride east, Victor Blackwood sat at a bar table with a drink he couldn't quite afford and a ledger that told him everything he didn't want to know. 3 failed arrangements, debts called in, a reputation that had curdled somewhere along the road. He thought about the years he'd operated smoothly, efficiently, with help that never complained because it knew better. He thought about Grenda. He had left her on the side of the road like broken equipment, but something in him, something he would have called pragmatism, and was actually something uglier, had begun to remember the value of what he had given up. He asked around. A stagecoach driver remembered a small town. A green-skinned woman, he said. Pretty, if you were the type to notice. Left at Redemption Springs. Victor paid the man for the information and sat very still for a moment. Then he ordered another drink and began to think. He had always been good at finding things he believed belonged to him. Back in Redemption Springs, Grenda blew out the lamp in her room and lay in the dark, listening to the farm settle around her. The creak of old wood, the distant sound of a horse moving in its stall, the wind against the window glass. She was warm. She was safe. She had no reason to feel the cold thread of unease that moved through her just before sleep, but she felt it anyway. Victor Blackwood arrived in Redemption Springs on a Wednesday, which seemed too ordinary a day for a storm. He came quietly. That was his skill and always had been. Presentation first, intention later. He wore his better coat and kept his horse well walked, and entered the town, looking like any other merchant passing through. He asked questions the way he always did, with the smile working ahead of the words. Who lived where? What the community was like. Whether any new arrivals had settled in the area recently. By Thursday afternoon, he knew exactly where she was. Grenda didn't know he was in town. Thursday was a regular teaching day. She had 6 children and a new lesson on simple arithmetic, and Clara had brought another list of written questions, this time about the Orc legend of the 2 rivers, which Grenda had told the previous week, and which Clara had apparently been analyzing with considerable intensity. She answered each question in turn. The morning moved the way good mornings did, warm and purposeful. The stove in the corner kept the room comfortable. The children were focused. She was in the middle of helping 2 of the younger ones with letter formation when the door opened. No knock. The cold came in first, then the footsteps. She knew those footsteps. Her body knew them before her mind caught up. The hands that had been guiding a small pencil went still. The child looked up at her. Something on her face made him go quiet too. Victor stood in the doorway, older by the months since she'd last seen him. Thinner, maybe. The coat was good, but the eyes were tired. He looked around the room with an expression that she recognized, the expression of a man doing a calculation. Grenda, he said pleasantly. She said nothing. You've made yourself comfortable. He looked at the children, at the books, at the small stove. I had to work to find you. You might have sent word. As if she owed him word. As if the months and the road and the bruises and the stagecoach door pushed open and her bag thrown into the dirt were simply an interruption in an ongoing arrangement. Her throat was dry. The old fear moved through her, fast and familiar, and for a moment she was 20 years old again, at a crossroads with the wrong boots and the last of her bread. Then she felt something else underneath it. Something harder. She looked at the children. Go wait outside for a moment, she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. Near the Harper house. Mrs. Fenton is in the street today. Find her. The children moved quickly. Clara was last, and she looked back once with her serious eyes. Grenda waited until the door closed. Then she turned to face him. I'm not going back, she said. Victor tilted his head. Going back. I haven't asked you to go anywhere. You have to leave. I don't think I do. He took a step into the room. I gave you years of shelter, meals, a position. You seem to have forgotten that. I haven't forgotten anything, she said. Her voice didn't shake. She noted it the way you note the weather, with a kind of surprised gratitude. He reached her in 3 steps and closed his hand around her wrist. The pain was immediate and old. She pulled against it. He had always been stronger than he looked. The door opened. Philip Harding stood in the frame. He took in the room in a single second. Victor's hand on her wrist, her position, her face. He moved without raising his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had shouted. He crossed the room and placed himself between them. "Let go of her," he said. Victor looked at him with the confidence of a man who had never fully understood the difference between the kind of authority money rented and the kind that was simply real. He didn't let go immediately. Philip's hand closed on Victor's forearm with the grip of someone who had spent 38 years working land that didn't yield easily. Victor let go. Grenda stepped back. Her wrist throbbed. She pressed it against her side and watched the two men face each other in the small room. "This doesn't concern you," Victor said. "She's standing in my town," Philip said. "Everything that happens to her concerns me." Victor straightened his coat. He looked at Grenda over Philip's shoulder with the expression she knew well, the one that said this wasn't finished, the one that had always preceded something worse. "We'll settle this properly," Victor said. "Outside." Philip held the door open and waited. Outside, a small crowd had already gathered. Clara had found Mrs. Fenton quickly, and Mrs. Fenton had found others. Elaine Harper was there, standing close to her daughter with a hand on her shoulder. Thomas Reed stood near the far side of the street, arms crossed, watching. Several ranch hands from the surrounding farms had come in for supplies and stayed when they sensed something wrong. Victor walked out first, still wearing his composed expression like a coat he hadn't fully earned. Grenda followed Philip into the light. The street held its breath. Victor looked at the gathered faces and made a quick calculation, the way he always did. He had spoken his way out of harder rooms than this. He straightened his shoulders and began. He talked about years of support, about opportunities given, about loyalty owed. He used the word arrangement 4 times and the word ungrateful once, which was once too many. The crowd listened. Philip stood beside Grenda, not in front of her. Beside her, she spoke. She had not planned to. She had spent years learning that speaking her truth only made things worse, that her words were taken as insolence or dismissed as irrelevance. But Philip was standing beside her, and the children were safe with Mrs. Fenton, and the whole town was watching. And something in her decided that if there was ever a moment to use her voice, this was it. She told them about the work, 6 years of it, without wages, without choice, without the freedom to leave. She told them about the words Victor had used, until they became part of how she heard her own name. She told them about the road, the last fight, the stagecoach door, her bag thrown into the dirt of this very street. She kept her voice even. She didn't perform it. She simply said it, the way you finally say a thing that has been pressing against the inside of your chest for years. When she finished, the street was quiet. Thomas Reed, who had taken a long time to look her in the eye, was looking at her now. His jaw was set. His arms were crossed. He was looking at Victor with an expression that contained everything he had always considered himself too practical to feel. Elaine Harper pulled Clara slightly closer. Her own jaw was tight. Victor tried to speak again. He tried the charm first, then the justification, then the version of the story in which he was owed something by everyone present. He spoke like a man who had always relied on his words arriving before other people's understanding. It didn't work this time. He reached for his jacket. Philip moved first. One hand, clean and final. Victor sat down hard in the dust of Redemption Springs. 2 men from the crowd stepped forward without being asked. Thomas Reed was one of them. They had the look of men who had been waiting for something useful to do. Victor was escorted to the edge of town with his horse and his good coat, and the information that he would not be welcome back. He left without looking at her. It was the most honest thing he had ever done. Elaine Harper approached Grenda when it was over. She put a hand briefly on her arm, said nothing, and nodded once. It was enough. Thomas Reed passed her on his way back across the street. He stopped. "My daughter reads well," he said, "because of you." He kept walking. Grenda stood in the street and let the afternoon settle around her. The dust Victor had kicked up on his way out drifted slowly down and disappeared. Philip came to stand beside her. He didn't speak for a moment. "You all right?" he said finally. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, "More than I expected." The evening came in softly. The children had gone home, each one told only that there had been a small difficulty and that lessons would continue tomorrow. Clara had looked at Grenda for a long moment before her mother led her away. Grenda sat on the steps of the community hall. The dust of the street had settled. The last amber of sunlight lay across the rooftops in long lines. Somewhere nearby, a door closed. A dog moved across the road. The ordinary world continued with its ordinary sounds, indifferent to what had just been resolved. Philip came and sat beside her. Not at a distance this time. Beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. She didn't move away. For a while neither of them spoke. The silence was the kind that didn't ask anything of you. "I've been thinking," she said finally, "that I'd like to stay. In Redemption Springs," he said. "Yes." She looked at the hills, darkening now as the light fell behind them. "Here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." One word, unhurried, final in the best way. She looked at her own hands in her lap, hands that had worked for years in service of someone else's life. They were still marked by it, the calluses, the old lines of labor. But they were hers. They were completely hers. Later that night, in her room at the Harding farm, she opened the window and let the cold air in. The stars were out in full. The kind of stars that required actual dark to show themselves, the kind that small towns had more of than they realized. She sat on the edge of her bed and began to sing. Not humming this time. The full voice her mother had given her, the one Victor had tried to silence with his contempt, the one that had learned to stay small for so long. The Wanderer's Return, the song about going so far from home that you forget what home is, and then finding it in an unexpected place. Not a place made of stone and fence line, but a kind of place, a feeling of ground beneath your feet that holds. The song ended the way her mother had always ended it, quietly, with a long note that fell into silence like a stone into still water. The silence after was not empty. It was full of everything. The years came later, in the way years do, patient and accumulating. Philip's proposal arrived on an ordinary morning, over coffee, at the kitchen table where Mrs. Fenton had first told her to sit down and eat. He said it plainly, the way he said most important things, without decoration or performance. She looked at him across the table, at the brown eyes that had never once looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, and she said yes before he finished the sentence. They married in the autumn, the season that had always felt like a rival to her. The farm became hers as much as his. The teaching room in the community hall became a proper school, small but real, with a proper door and a chalkboard. Philip built himself over one long winter weekend. The children grew, and new ones arrived, and she taught them all, letters and numbers, and the two kinds of stories her parents had given her. And on the mornings when she would hear it, coming from somewhere in the house, small voices singing the old songs, her children, their voices still unpracticed and unself-conscious, singing the Orc songs she had taught them the way Lyra had taught her, as something worth keeping, as something that belonged to them now. She would stop whatever she was doing. She would stand very still and listen to every word. And she would know, with the deep and quiet certainty of someone who had walked a very long road to arrive exactly where they were standing, that this was it. This was the place the song had always been about.